Welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. I'm joined today by Christian Clemente. Another reaction episode. Me and Jason had one of these earlier in the week to DJ Durkin as Auburn's new defensive coordinator, and we thought, well, great. The defensive staff is now complete. The assistant coaching staff is now complete. We were wrong, of course. And Christian, this is something that we had sort of caught wind of over the last 48 hours, really while we were in Mobile for the Senior Bowl, started hearing about this, ends up coming to fruition today that Jeremy Garrett is off to the NFL, Auburn's defensive line coach. He's leaving to go coach for the Jacksonville Jaguars. We were able to confirm here on getting close to here Friday evening. So, Christian, this is something you and I were talking about even earlier in the day. Started to get some text messages. We believe that Jeremy Garrett did inform the team today of that decision. And before we get into what's next for Auburn, this is a guy that Hugh Freeze didn't want to lose. This is a very highly regarded coach in the industry. A guy who really, when you look at, it was only a few years ago that he was coaching at Liberty in his first full-time assistant job. This is somebody who has moved up the ranks very, very quickly. And you look at his product on the field and the way he recruits, and it's really no surprise as to why.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it later in the show in terms of recruiting, but he's been an ace recruiter for Auburn, and it's definitely not someone that Hugh Freeze wanted to lose. But at the same time, I'm sure, I don't know this, but I'm sure Hugh Freeze was happy that one of his guys was able to go to the NFL, especially at this age. This is a guy that Hugh Freeze has known and been connected with for a long time. Obviously was a former NFL assistant defensive line coach for the Cleveland Browns. That was kind of where he first started to make his name a little bit before going over to Liberty with Hugh. And then he came over to Auburn as well. So now he moves on and he gets a bigger jump as taking the official kind of defensive line coach job there with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So it's really good for him. Every time we've had an opportunity to talk with him in different media opportunities or be around him, he's just been just fantastic to really be around. Really good guy. Philip Marshall, obviously, who works with us, had a really, really good column during the season, talking with JG and talking with, I think it was JG's dad as well. Talking about him growing up kind of in the country a little bit there in Mississippi. So he's been really good. You lose some of those ties in the state of Mississippi that you had, depending on the hire and what comes next. Obviously, that'll remain to be seen what goes on from there. And obviously, we'll talk about his 25 class. But a blow for Auburn is you finally start to feel solidified. You feel comfortable with your staff. You feel good to go. You feel like you've upgraded at different positions. And then you lose a guy to the NFL. There's not much you can do about it. It's the way college football is trending right now, Nathan. We've been talking about it. We've been seeing it. Obviously, Boston College loses its head coach to take a defensive coordinator job in the NFL. Chip Kelly is just campaigning for offensive coordinator jobs, it feels like, in the NFL right now. It's the way things are trending with the way the schedule is, recruiting your roster, recruiting transfer portal, recruiting high school, recruiting JUCO, all of that stuff. It's making it tough for these coaches to where even if you're making more money at that position in college, I think it was you said it, it's hazard pay. I mean, it's because how much more work you have to do. You're barely coaching, you're recruiting, and you're having to recruit your own roster the whole time. So Auburn loses Jeremy Garrett to the NFL, and he takes the next step in his career.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's been the theme of this week and the Jeff Hafley news. For those who don't know, Boston College's sitting head coach, I believe they won 9 games this season, or at least 8 games. They had a good season. They had
for
a
Boston
good year.
College standards, yeah.
Yes, for Boston College standards. A guy who's a former Ohio State assistant, really good recruiter. He had that program going in the right direction. Leaves to become the defensive coordinator of the Packers, and it's for these reasons that Christian just pointed out. I was talking to somebody in Auburn's building a few weeks ago, Christian, who told me that one of their friends in the industry just decided to up and quit recently, just because of how difficult the job has become. Now, I think when we talk about that, sometimes people think, oh, cry me a river a little bit because these coaches get paid millions of dollars. And while there is a little bit of validity into that side of things, what you mentioned is the important part. There is not a bunch of time to just coach football right now. When you have to, the managing your own roster thing is kind of the new one. That's what's come up recently. Transfer portal has been a thing for a while. Of course, you always have to recruit at the college level, but it's the combination of recruiting and recruiting your own roster. And Jeremy Garrett is somebody that we saw in the transfer portal along the defensive line work super hard. There were some decisions going back and forth with guys like Justin Rogers. Marcus Harris leaves for the NFL. It is an incredibly involved job on the college level now, in all kinds of facets. And look, this is not going to be. We'll get into the names in a second that we're kind of looking for, but in terms of the on-field production, this is a big loss for them, because we talked about it all offseason. Then you get into the year, that defensive line was kind of a surprise group for Auburn in 2023. They weren't spectacular by any means, but Marcus Harris was first team All SEC. He was phenomenal. He thrived under Jeremy Garrett. And there were a bunch of other guys who had better seasons than maybe we expected. It ended up being a respectable group that had some really good games, as opposed to, we kind of thought that it might have been a little bit of a liability. And a lot of that is to Jeremy Garrett's credit.
Yeah, look, given what Jeremy Garrett inherited, it was a room that outperformed its expectations for sure. I mean, some people might say, oh, well, the D-line wasn't necessarily all that great, so that isn't a big loss. But look what he inherited and look what he's trying to build. You look and you see what he got in the 2024 class with a guy like Malik Blockton, a guy like TJ Lindsey, who looks just incredible whenever you see him, a guy like Amaris Williams, who got bumped up to 5-star status, kind of an edge, maybe a defensive end type guy, depending on where he fits in. Jamonte Waller, he played a big part in that as well. So he was a really good recruiter who was looking to build up the future of that room and had continued to do so through the portal. Even look at some of those portal guys that he got. Like a guy like Lawrence Johnson was very quietly like a solid player for the defensive line. Like you didn't expect him to be great, and you thought, I don't know what this guy's really going to bring. He was solid. Messiah Nasili Kite, before he got hurt, was pretty solid for that D-line. So he was good. He had the future of that room starting to trend up, and it'll be up to whoever the new guy is to kind of continue that.
Yeah, I mean, and even in this class right now, Gage Keys is a guy that we think can be pretty good. Trill Carter, probably with Justin Rogers leaving, Trill Carter's probably going to have an opportunity to be the starting nose tackle on this team next season. And then I go back to somebody like Justin Rogers. I mean, I know Justin Rogers didn't necessarily pan out and be the kind of dominant player that maybe Auburn thought he could have been. But we were talking about it this week, Christian, about how coveted he was looking back last year. I mean, Alabama, LSU, Georgia, USC, I believe, were the other ones that were contending for his services. And so all that is to say, as now we talk about, what's next for this position group and this position coach, it's big shoes to fill. Talking about some of the names, these are at least some that we've heard some buzz about recently. The number one name that I think Auburn fans will want to talk about and want to address is a guy like Rodney Garner. Now, Rodney Garner has been at Tennessee since obviously Gus Malzahn left and they went into the Brian Harsin era. He obviously hasn't been a part of Auburn's staff since then, but this is a guy that there's really no denying the production that his defensive lines had, an absolute dynamite recruiter. And I think anytime you have a position like this open, you always have to consider a Rodney Garner, because he's somebody who loves Auburn, loved to live here when he was here, loved to coach here. Obviously, he was a standout player at Auburn as well. A couple other interesting names too, maybe to keep an eye on. One that you had been talking about this week is a guy named Kyle Pope. He was linebackers coach at one point when Freeze was at Liberty. You had Josh Aldridge, who is Auburn's linebackers coach now. When Aldridge was on the D line, Kyle Pope was there coaching linebackers. He's also a former grad assistant at Alabama, and he went on to be a really good defensive line coach at Memphis over the past few seasons. Really, really highly regarded there. And then he has lined up the Georgia Tech linebacker's job at the moment. But Christian, as we saw with Wesley McGriff, and nowadays in college football, like that is assuming he didn't sign a contract yet, which most of the time you don't until like February or March. That doesn't really matter. So Auburn, those are a couple guys at least to keep an eye on as we begin this. Who else are you sort of keeping your eye open for? There's somebody on staff too that I neglected to mention that might be worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, those are two of the main ones. Obviously, everyone knows about Rodney Garner. I don't have to go in depth on him. Kyle Pope, the second most famous Sylacauga native behind Jason Caldwell. But no, that's one that maybe people might not know quite as much about. But he's a younger guy, almost kind of fits a Jeremy Garrett style in a sense, where he's a younger guy trying to. I don't know what I'm looking to say here. This is bad podcasting right here, but he's looking to make a name for himself a little bit. And so he's an Alabama native that would potentially have an opportunity to do that. And with the connection to Hugh Freeze, Trey Scott is another name to keep an eye on a little bit, the Georgia defensive line coach. He was a graduate assistant at Ole Miss. I believe he overlapped with Hugh Freeze there.
Yep.
So they have a little bit of a connection there. Look, pulling him from Georgia to fill the same position seems unlikely, but you at least have a connection there. And that's one that I'd even heard just a little bit about him being in the defensive coordinator as a guy that they were keeping an eye on. So
his name had been in the mix even for jobs before Freeze got here. So Auburn has always kind of
had
feelers out.
Look, that's one to at least keep an eye on. And then the last one, you mentioned it, Vontrell King-Williams, the assistant defensive line coach who has been here the past year working under Jeremy Garrett. Look, he has connections to Hugh Freeze. That's the reason he came over here. He was the Eastern Michigan defensive line coach, and he came to be the assistant defensive line coach at Auburn. And so he worked here the past year. Him and Jeremy Garrett were a really good dynamic duo. So the potential to just elevate him is definitely out there. He's hit the road recruiting. He's done that before. He's a younger guy. So those are 4 names that we're keeping an eye on as of right now. Within the past hour of the news happening, obviously, I'm sure more names will be vetted, but it feels like those 4 are the main ones that you really need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, in terms of continuity, I mean, Vontrell is a guy, like you mentioned, a dynamic duo. That really felt like, guys.
They were always together.
I was gonna say, guys have analysts, guys have people with them for different reasons, but that truly felt like an NFL type role where it's like literally an assistant, kind of like how Ken Austin this year was so clear. It's like that's the assistant quarterback coach. I mean, in every Auburn puts out these videos of when they'd flip these defensive linemen, and right there with Jeremy Garrett is Vontrell. And so, in terms of continuity on the staff, in terms of continuity with the current roster, that's somebody you definitely have to keep an eye on.
I was just going to say real quick, look, if Vontrell doesn't get the job, I'm sure that's a guy that Hugh Freeze will still want to keep around as that assistant defensive line coach, assuming that Vontrell doesn't get a job elsewhere.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. That feels, it feels like just a matter of time when he's going to be able to have a bigger opportunity because like you mentioned, he was a sitting FBS assistant coach when Auburn got him to come be an analyst here. The recruiting aspect of this news is probably the biggest part because you were looking at that 2025 class and saying Auburn is in position to clean up really well along the defensive line. They had already done so in 2024. And even Jeremy Garrett's a guy who came in and helped them land Keldrick Falk, Zach Etheridge and obviously Freeze, the guys that they put in a bunch of effort to flip him. But at the end of the day, Garrett was there. Garrett ended up being his defensive line coach. You mentioned Amaris Williams. That's a guy who's a 5-star now. LJ McCray from Florida. Garrett was a big reason why Auburn was in there at the end with a chance to flip him. He played a role in Jamonte Waller, who's kind of a fringe 5-star pass rusher now, along with the other defensive linemen they've recruited. But talk to me a little bit, Christian, about the importance of keeping this 2025 class where it is and bringing in somebody that's going to be able to do that because Antonio Coleman is a guy that down the road could be a 5-star type player. Malik Autry is a guy Auburn visited today from Opelika, one of the best defensive linemen in the country. And you look at other spots in 2025, other places, they're going to have an opportunity to get really good defensive linemen. So it feels like Hugh Freeze said it. Hugh Freeze said it to us this week in Mobile. He said, he repeated the line again. If I don't do well in 24 and 25, I'm probably not going to be here very long. Well, if you kind of zoom in a little bit on 2025, the defensive line is such a crucial spot for Auburn to be able to do really well. Feels like this hire 2 years down the road it's going to be a pretty big deal for them to make sure they can continue to do that.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, we're talking about it right now on February 2nd, and Auburn's defensive line class for the 2025 class was like almost done in terms of true defensive linemen. You have 4 commitments as of right now in Malik Autry, Jordan Crawford, Antonio Coleman, and Kalen Edwards. Excuse me. And Kalen Edwards is the only one that's not a top 247 guy, but he's still a 4-star in the industry-generated 24/7 Sports composite. So you had a really good defensive line class. The only actual defensive lineman, like true defensive tackle, defensive end guy that you were still recruiting really heavily to try and join them was Andrew Maddox from Oak Grove there in Mississippi. Jeremy Garrett felt like if he could get him as his 5th guy, then you're good. Then you just need to add some edge rushers, guys like Zion Grady, Jared Smith, some of those guys, and try and complement the class on the edge. But Jeremy Garrett had already pretty much built out his 2025 class. And just like you mentioned, that's what's going to be really interesting to see what happens. Can Hugh Freeze, can whoever the new defensive line coach hold on? Does the new defensive line coach want these guys? They're all really talented, but do they fit what he's looking for? whether it's culturally, schematically, whatever it may be. Odds are yes, very, very likely yes for all of these guys. But you never know. And so Malik Autry, he was, like you mentioned, Auburn went to go and see him on Friday. That was another one of the red flags when you saw the picture Malik posted with Hugh Freeze and DJ Durkin, but no Jeremy Garrett. Malik Autry actually went over to campus on Friday. He was there for a visit. Shortly after that visit from the coaching staff, he went to just go watch them do winter workouts. Didn't get a chance to speak with him. I think he might be there tomorrow again on Saturday. So we'll see what happens there. Antonio Coleman, the one that you've already flipped from Alabama, Auburn's going to have to fight to hold on there. Obviously, Alabama, Kalen DeBoer kept Freddie Roach. And so now I'm sure he's getting some phone calls up from Tuscaloosa trying to get him back. Jordan Crawford is one that really, really, really likes Auburn, just for Auburn. So it'll be interesting to see if he ends up changing anything there. I think if you have any sort of advantage, if you're Auburn in this situation, it's the fact that Hugh Freeze has been very, very active recruiting. All of these guys know Hugh Freeze pretty well at this point, which a lot of recruits probably can't say about a head coach, especially at this stage in the 2025 class. So I'm sure Hugh Freeze will be on the phone with these guys tonight or tomorrow, trying to reach out to them and talk with them a little bit. Same with DJ Durkin. Now that he's on the job, he's been on the job for the past couple of days. So we'll see what happens. It's a tough blow for your 2025 class. You have 8 commitments and 4 of them are true defensive linemen. So now you have to fight to hold on to those guys.
Yeah, big task. And, Hugh Freeze talked about this week some of the reasons for hiring DJ Durkin as his new defensive coordinator. Surely Hugh Freeze knew that this was a possibility, and recruiting was one of those reasons. And so you mentioned it, Freeze, Durkin, guys like Aldridge there, who has a hand in those, linebacker type edge guys, who are on the defensive front. All those guys are going to be in overdrive a little bit now as they look for their new defensive line coach. We mentioned Vontrell earlier. Auburn's bringing in a bunch of visitors this weekend.
Yeah, that's the other thing I should have mentioned. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, you've got him. I mean, assuming that he'll kind of fall into that slot now. If you're Auburn, you're glad that he was doing so much recruiting work previously, because now he's got a relationship with those guys, and that'll be the guy this weekend that will be able to host those guys, and will be working recruiting those guys. Because like Christian mentioned, Autry, Jeremy Garrett didn't go visit Autry. We actually saw Jeremy this week in Mobile, going down to the Senior Bowl. But as we understand it, he sort of delivered the message on Friday that he's moving on now to the NFL. And so another assistant job comes open. Of course, we'll have it all covered for you guys at Auburn Undercover as Hugh Freeze looks to replace. This will now be, when they hire this coach, that'll be 5 new assistants on this staff. So basically half the staff turns over going into year 2. Will it be the last one too? I don't know. We'll see. It really is this time of year. I remember Burt Watts a couple years ago.
That's a name I've not heard in a long time.
It was the day of the Super Bowl. I don't know if you remember that. It was like the afternoon of the Super Bowl. The Broncos hired him. And look, the NFL thing, it's always attractive for coaches to go to the NFL. But this is something you saw this week, people talking a lot about. And I'm not saying this is like Jeremy Garrett was already an NFL guy who had been really successful. I mean, Coach Myles Garrett, he had coached Ed Oliver. I think Olivier Vernon as well. He had coached in the NFL. And so he was a guy who was really highly respected with the Browns. He always felt like maybe, he had an opportunity to get back there. But I just think, along with everybody else in college football, that maybe, the Jeff Hafley stuff really felt like maybe a sign of things to come. And until they fix things, look, the SEC and the Big Ten said today, hey, we're putting our heads together and we're going to try to fix some stuff. If Hugh Freeze and any other high-level coach have a say in any of what it needs to be fixed, it will be this recruiting calendar. It will be, roster management, NIL, all that kind of stuff. We talked Freeze this week. He brings in somebody like Will Redmond as his new player personnel GM over from LSU. You need people like that now. I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent here, but it just, there's lots of levels to this stuff, I think, than people just looking at, kind of scrolling through Twitter and, people just kind of being ridiculous about like, Auburn's got a bunch of problems because coaches are leaving. A, you definitely want guys to go to the NFL because that obviously shows that they were a pretty good coach. And B, you're kind of seeing this effect happen everywhere where, like you mentioned, it's kind of hazard pay right now in college football. So maybe we'll start to see that get fixed here in the near future. But Christian, if you don't have anything else, I think we may shut it down there. Just want to record a reaction episode for you guys here on this Friday to listen to going into the weekend. Hopefully this is something that gets done. I would imagine, as opposed to the coordinator search, like this is something that you probably want to hit pretty quickly.
I don't think it'll take long.
Yeah, we'll see how this progresses within the next day. The next few days going into the weekend, going into next week for them. Looking for a new defensive line coach. So for Christian Clemente, I'm Nathan King. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We will talk to you all later. Everybody enjoyed the episode. We'll talk to you all soon.